is what George Floyd said 25 times when he was being killed on the 25th of May. Just 4 days ago, the transcript of proceedings from the camera footage of the 4 policemen was released in court. I'm just going to read you a little bit contained in the Washington Post from 3 days ago. George Floyd's mouth appeared to be bleeding at that point after he bumped his face inside the vehicle. And one of the policemen requested emergency help at the scene, but by then, Floyd had started to complain that he couldn't breathe. "I've just had COVID, man," he said. "I can't breathe. I can't breathe. One of you, please listen to me." He repeatedly called out for his mother. "You're under arrest," said Chauvin, the leading policeman. All right. Oh my God, I can't believe this. I can't believe this," said Floyd. "Mama, I love you. Tell my kids I love them. I'm dead." "You're doing a lot of talking, man," Chauvin replied. "You're doing just fine," said Chauvin. "You're doing just fine." Kyung said, as Lane told him, to take a deep breath, and the lead policeman said, to relax. "They're going to kill me," Floyd said. "They're going to kill me. That takes a lot of oxygen to say that," said Chauvin, now convicted of murder. When it became clear on the 25th of May that George Floyd could not breathe and no longer breathed, this is what the great man, who we just remembered, John Lewis, at the beginning of proceedings today said. "People now understand," said Congressman Lewis, "what the struggle was all about. It's another step down a very long road towards freedom, justice for all humankind. A very long step down that road." While we have been here on this conference this morning, a man has appeared in the Magistrates' Court at Highbury Corner. Yes, it's on the BBC News, it's on Sky News, it's on ITV News. This is Marcus Coutain, 45. On Thursday, he was stopped by police in Islington in North London, and 2 of them held him to the ground, and 1 of them put his knee on his neck. The incident has been reported to the Independent Office of Police Conduct. And I'm going to read you just what it says on the BBC website this morning. Several police cars arrived at the scene after the arresting officers were confronted by onlookers. An eyewitness told the BBC, "I was worried he was going to get executed. That's just how George Floyd got killed. If not for the crowds filming the police, they could have suffocated him or broken his neck. He was on the floor and in handcuffs. What's the reason for kneeling on his neck?" That was Thursday. This morning he's in court, apparently for having a knife. But whether he had a knife or didn't have a knife, for whatever reason, to put a knee on his neck as a black man was unacceptable. I tell you that to remind us that the realities of what we've seen in America are also sometimes, but less by proportion, but sometimes the realities of our streets in the UK. In the very same week that George Floyd's funeral took place, on the 9th of June, while we've all been in theory lockdown, Rayshard Brooks was also shot in Atlanta by American police just 3 days later. In other words, the fact of "I can't breathe," or the fact of a knee on a neck, or the fact of the relentless slaughters in the US of young black men killed by the police doesn't seem to affect the outcome. Even just 2 weekends ago, Bianca Williams and Ricardo dos Santos in London stopped on a weekend. The woman hauled from her car with her little baby in the back of the car, a policeman standing there in London with a hammer to smash the window. These things are ingrained, absolutely embedded, indoctrinated discriminations that take no regard for the significance importance of Black lives. And that's why Black lives do matter. When we think of I can't breathe, we've got to think of the facts that take our breath away. What is it we need to be conscious of as we seek to change history, rewrite it from a different angle, contain other actors, ensure that we understand the full context? So I'm going to take you through two short videos. The first one coming up now, Jim Corral will have it ready for us. It is just a very brief, short video that shows you the impact of what housing policy in the US meant for education policy. Just take a look at this.
A town east of New York City, 17,000 homes in one place. What bank would be crazy enough to lend a developer the money to build 17,000 homes or 15,000 homes in one place for which he had no buyers? We were in a suburban country at that time. People thought the whole idea was lunacy. Who's going to want to live in a single-family home when they can live in the city instead? Any of these developers, the only way they could get the capital to build these giant subdivisions was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for the development, for approval of the construction materials they were going to use, the architectural design, the layout of the streets in the subdivision, and an explicit commitment not to sell a home to an African American, required by the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration even required, as a condition of these guarantees, developers like Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. These deeds still exist in these homes today. They're no longer enforced, no longer enforceable, but they're still there. What was the consequence of this? Well, those homes in those days, in all of these suburbs, they sold for $10,000 or less, $8,000, $9,000 a piece. In today's money, that's less than $100,000, probably $90,000. African Americans who were prohibited, not they didn't want to, not because they didn't like living among whites, they were prohibited from moving into these suburbs, and they could easily afford to do so. Any working class family can afford to buy a home for $90,000, roughly twice national median income. Those homes and developments like that now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 and more. The white families over the next couple of generations gained, you can do the arithmetic, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in equity. They used that equity to send their children to college, to take care of medical emergencies, to take care of economic downturns, most importantly, to bequeath it to their children, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans who accumulated none of that wealth as a result of this federal subsidy had none of those abilities. Today, nationwide, African American incomes are on average about 60% of white incomes. African American wealth today is 10% of white wealth. That enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy practiced in the mid-20th century that has never been remedied. It's a constitutional violation, and of course it determines the ongoing racial inequalities we have today.
Sometimes it's just important that we understand how it is possible to institutionalize economic discrimination, to institutionalize disparity. The figures of economic difference between black and white families in the US are paralleled in the UK. In fact, they're pretty exactly the same. And as the video I just showed you reveals, what African American families were forbidden almost from doing was being able to invest in their children's future and in their children's property applies similarly here. The great divide in our education system, and of course the maintenance of the traditional curriculum style, is because of the preponderance of the elite private schools. Now, I went to one, and I'm not against the system, but I'm against its dominance. I'm against the fact that it doesn't seek to be the key driver of change, although credit going to Eton for saying they will decolonize their curriculum. But income is a vital way, resource and economy are a vital way for putting breath back into the reality of the futures we want to build for our children. One of the things that determines so much of how people feel about their prospects, whether it's here in the UK or it's in the US, is whether the criminal justice system, let alone the education system, bears in deeply upon survival, rights, and freedoms. So in the very week after George Floyd's funeral, Time magazine, a great journal, talked of the overdue awakening that this had all brought to America and to the world. They referred to his death as being showing Black people's vulnerability and marginalization. And then they gave some hard facts and a key conclusion. The hard facts were this: by most measures, the numbers of those incarcerated in the US are simply remarkable. 2.3 million people held in prisons and jails, greater than any other country in the world, including China, which imprisons 1.7 million, the US 2.3 million. The proportions mean that 33% of the US population is Black. And so it is to pretty close in the UK, in the South. Similar proportions apply. 10 times more likely to be stopped and searched. We know that from latest evidence. Higher proportions of Black young men in prison going through juvenile offending or through adult prisons. Here was the conclusion of Time magazine. Mass incarceration means, talking of America, that this country approaches its problems through the criminal justice system. When faced with a social ill, our nation responds by building more prisons and more jails, because to incarcerate is the tool that we use to address societal problems. We've erected few limitations on the police's ability to keep the social order. Police can stop whoever they want to stop, whenever they want to stop them. They can investigate things that have no relation to the reason for the stop. They can use force. They can even kill. The importance of us understanding that I can't breathe isn't just the moment in which it was expressed by George Floyd and the others who've gone before, or the incident that happened in Islington on Thursday of this week. Get off my neck, said this man, get off my neck. It is to express that actually we need to have our breath taken away in a sense of shock, in a sense of dismay, in a sense of fury about the dislocation of resources, capacity, and opportunity that is afforded, especially to Black young women and men. Now my second video. Here is something which is really going to tell us about partly driving towards a solution, but it's a big driver. These are the words of Brian Stevenson. If you saw the film Just Mercy at the beginning of this year, which talks about miscarriages of justice, well, here's Brian Stevenson giving a critical context of what to do next. A lawyer, an advocate, a fighter for freedom. Jim, play this second video.
Until we understand the truth of our history, every effort at repair will fail. Most people ask the question, do you support reparations? Don't know what the word means. They think it's some check. There is no sufficient check you can put in the mail. It means something much more dynamic, much more inclusive, and much more substantial. After apartheid in South Africa, there was a recognition that they couldn't get to a healthy place without a commitment to truth and reconciliation. There were convenings where people who had been victimized by apartheid and discouraged and traumatized by that bigotry could have place to give voice to it. If you go to Johannesburg today, their constitutional court is surrounded by the emblems, the monuments, the symbols that are designed to make sure no one forgets the inequality of apartheid. In Rwanda, there was a recognition that the country couldn't recover from that horrific genocide without a process of truth and reconciliation, truth and repair, truth and justice. And you can't spend a day in Rwanda without people talking to you about the genocide. It's urgent to them that everyone understand what happened there. In Germany, you can't go 200 meters without seeing markers or monuments or stones that have been placed next to the homes of Jewish families that were abducted during the Holocaust. The Germans actually want you to go to the Holocaust Memorial. They're trying to change the narrative. There are no Adolf Hitler statues in Germany. Swastikas have been banned. There's a consciousness to never again fall prey to the politics of fear and anger that gave rise to that Holocaust. In this country, we don't talk about slavery. We don't talk about the native genocide. We don't talk about lynching. We don't talk about segregation. You start talking about race and people get nervous. You start talking about racial justice and people are looking for exits. Our landscape is littered with iconography designed to romanticize the period of enslavement, to celebrate and honor the architects and defenders of slavery. People get very, very uncomfortable when you start talking about how we begin to deconstruct this legacy of bias and segregation. We talk about transitional justice in other places in the world. The State Department is even funded to assist in those efforts in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, but we've never done it in this country. And I think the time is now. In law school, you're taught if someone's rights are violated, there have to be remedies. And the remedies are shaped by the nature of the violation, which is understanding what the motives are, what the intent was, what's the extent of the injury is central to what kind of remedy you impose. And I think we have too many people in this country who want to talk about truth and repair, or truth and reconciliation, and truth and justice, and they want to skip the truth part and jump right to the reparation or reconciliation part. I don't think it works that way. It's the truth part that's actually the hard part. When we all have a consciousness of the truth, the repair part actually becomes so much easier. So I'm resistant to any effort to reduce the project in front of us to something that allows us to skip the truth. Most people in this country know nothing about what happened to African Americans in the first half of the 20th century when 6 million fled the American South as refugees and exiles. Most of us know nothing about the brutality of the domestic slave trade and the way thousands of African American families were pulled apart, where women were brutalized and raped, where men were reduced to objects, where children were sold away from their parents. And until we know those details, we can't appreciate what kind of remedy, what kind of repair is needed. I go into courts and jails, and my clients who've been convicted of crimes, to be released, have to go before a parole board typically, and they have to acknowledge the wrongfulness of their crime. And they do that because the parole board won't let them out if they still distrust them to acknowledge the wrongfulness of what they do. They don't trust people who aren't prepared to express remorse and regret. My clients need to do that to understand that wrongfulness so that they won't reoffend. I think the same is true for this nation. I think we have to articulate the wrong that was done. We have to express remorse and regret. We have to feel some of the shame that we should feel about this history of racial inequality. I want an era of truth and reconciliation in this country, truth and justice, truth and repair. I want to see what happened in South Africa and Rwanda and Germany happen here. I want the landscape to change. I want the iconography to change. I want all of these totems to the Confederacy and these false narratives to end. I want us to stop tolerating bigotry and bias in the workplace, in the school place. I want something fundamental to happen. And then I want to experience something that feels more like freedom and equality and justice than we have experienced in this country today.
Thank you. So I wrap with this, 2 quotes. When Barack Obama, the president, awarded that remarkable man, John Lewis, in 2011 with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, he said these words: "Generations from now, when parents teach their children what it means to have courage, John Lewis will come to mind, whose life is a lesson in the fierce urgency of now." And the now was so clearly expressed by Brian Stevenson, the radicalism that is needed to be able to take our breath away and then to get breath again, so we have ease. And Albert Einstein, who left us with this thought: the world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything.